She escaped the Trans-Allegheny Asylum on a Tuesday, using a spoon, a prayer, and a guard's moment of inattention. Her new identity was purchased for $30 from a Chicago agency by a rancher in the Nebraska Territory. He knew only three things: her name was Elena, she could sew, and she was desperate. He did not know the woman stepping off the stagecoach was an imposter, or that the law was already on its way. This is the true story of escape and reinvention in the American West, where a broken system created both prisons and opportunities. For hundreds of women, becoming a mail-order bride was a last chance at freedom, but for one, it was a perfect cover. Her gamble was simple: assume a dead woman's place or be dragged back to a cage, and the man who bought her had secrets of his own. Her name wasn't Elena, it was Clara Finley, and she was committed to the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in the winter of 1881, not for madness, but for defiance. Her crime was refusing to marry the 50-year-old business partner her father had chosen. A doctor, paid for the diagnosis, cited acute melancholia and moral insanity. She was 20 years old. The asylum held over 250 patients with a staff of just 12. Escapes weren't just possible, they were inevitable for those who kept their wits. Clara kept hers by staying silent, observing routines, and hiding a spoon from her meal tray for 11 months. The real Elena Darrow was a different story entirely. A seamstress from Philadelphia, she answered an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times placed by one Silas Gage of Cherry County, Nebraska. Their correspondence lasted 6 months. He sent train fare. She boarded a westbound car in the spring of 1882 and vanished. The agency in Chicago received a final letter from Silas, brief and without detail, stating Elena had arrived safely. They closed the file. But the Elena who stepped off the stagecoach in Nebraska 1 year later was an imposter wearing a dead woman's clothes. Clara's escape was a thing of desperate, quiet genius. During a poorly supervised walk in the asylum's overgrown courtyard, she slipped into a drainage culvert she had seen the groundskeepers clear. She crawled through half a mile of freezing runoff, emerging into a creek beyond the asylum walls. She stole a drying dress from a farmhouse line. With no money and no plan, she walked until she found rail workers. She traded labor for a place in a freight car heading west. Her only thought was distance. She arrived in Chicago with pneumonia and the last of her strength. In a boarding house, feverish, she heard the other women talking about the Lion Marriage Bureau. For a $5 fee, they promised a fresh start out west with a man of means. It was a system built on trust and vague paperwork. They required no birth certificate, no family references. Clara saw her chance. She remembered a name from a discarded newspaper fragment she'd used to stuff her shoes against the cold. Elena Darrow, missing, presumed dead. She walked into the agency and became her. The Lion Bureau's process was shockingly simple. Clara, now Elena, wrote a letter describing herself as pious, hardworking, and orphaned. She used the real Elena's history from the newspaper. The agent matched her with a new client, a rancher named Jacob Hendricks in the Nebraska Territory. But as Clara prepared to leave, a frantic clerk pulled her aside. There had been a terrible mistake. Her original match from a year prior had never been formally cancelled. A man named Silas Gage had already paid her fee. He was expecting an Elena Darrow, and he was not a man you disappointed. Silas Gage was a ghost in his own right. A former cavalry scout, he homesteaded a remote parcel in the Sandhills, a vast, lonely sea of grass. Neighbors, few and far between, knew him as capable and brutally quiet. He had written to the original Elena about wanting a partner for the silence, not just the work. His letters, which Clara now possessed, spoke of a place called Wolf Creek and a house he'd built with timber hauled 40 miles. They also contained a warning: do not speak of your past, and I will not speak of mine. With no choice, Clara boarded the train to Nebraska as Elena Darrow, carrying another woman's hopes and a man's dangerous secrecy. The journey took 4 days. Each mile felt like a theft. She practiced the signature from the real Elena's letters until her hand ached. She memorized the details of a life that wasn't hers, a childhood in Philadelphia, a deceased father who was a school teacher, a love of lavender. She buried Clara Finley deeper with every rotation of the train's wheels. The town of Seneca Springs was just a water tower, a saloon, and a general store. The stagecoach dropped her there. As the dust settled, she saw him. Silas Gage stood beside a buckboard wagon, a man carved from the landscape itself. He was tall, lean, with a beard streaked with early gray and eyes the color of a winter sky. He didn't smile. He simply looked at her, a long, assessing stare that felt like being stripped bare. He nodded once. "Miss Darrow." His voice was gravel and low wind. He helped her into the wagon without another word. The ride to his homestead took 3 hours through rolling, empty hills. The silence between them was a tangible thing. Clara watched his hands on the reins, knotting the faded scar across his knuckles, the way he checked the horizon constantly, like a man expecting trouble. He finally spoke as a rough line of trees appeared in the distance. "Wolf Creek," he said. "The house is just beyond." Then he added, almost too softly to hear, "The past stays behind us. That's the only rule." The house was a surprise. It wasn't a sod hut, but a sturdy log cabin with a real glass window and a porch. It spoke of skill and solitary effort. Inside was spare but clean. A table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove. A curtain divided the main room from a sleeping area. On the table was a single wildflower in a tin can. It was the only gesture that hinted at the man who had written those longing letters. He showed her where everything was: the well, the root cellar, the chicken coop, with the efficiency of a military briefing. His distance was a wall. That first night, after a sup of beans and salt pork eaten in silence, he handed her a small ledger. "The account book," he said, "for household goods." Inside, in a precise, sharp hand, were entries dating back 2 years, and there on a page from the previous spring was an entry that stopped her heart. It read, "March 12th, payment to Stagecoach Line, passenger fare for E. Darrow." The date was 3 weeks after the real Elena had supposedly arrived. A payment for a journey that had already happened, or a payment to make someone disappear. Clara lay awake that night on her narrow cot, listening to the wind in the grass and the deep, even breathing of the stranger on the other side of the curtain. She had escaped an asylum to avoid being owned, only to find herself the property of a man who kept the books for a ghost. She thought she was running from her past, but she had just walked directly into his. And in the morning, she would find the letters, not the ones he sent to Philadelphia, but the ones he had received, hidden in a box beneath the floorboards, that would tell her exactly what happened to the first Elena Darrow. The letters were not from the real Elena, they were to her, and they told a story the Lion Bureau never could. The first was dated March 1st, 1882, from Sealers to his sister in St. Louis. It read in part, "The woman from Philadelphia arrives tomorrow. I pray she is as strong as her letters suggest. This life breaks the soft ones." The second was a tattered railway timetable. The third was a single line, unsigned, on a scrap of ledger paper: "Payment received. Matter concluded." No trace, but the fourth letter was the one that turned the air in Clara's lungs to ice. It was from a county sheriff's office, addressed to Sealers Gage. It was a notice of inquest. The subject was the death of one Elena Darrow, cause undetermined, body found in a ravine 5 miles from the Wolf Creek homestead. The date was March 20th, 1882, 1 week after her arrival. Clara's hands shook so badly the paper rattled. The ledger entry, the secret payment, the sheriff's notice, it painted a horrifying picture. She had walked into the home of a man who may have disposed of his last mail-order bride. The past stays behind us rule wasn't just about privacy, it was about burial. She shoved the papers back into the box, her mind racing. She could run now, steal a horse, vanish into the hills. But to where? The asylum's reach, or her father's, felt closer out in the open. Here, at least, she had a roof and identity that, for the moment, was holding. She decided to stay, but to learn, to watch him like prey watches a predator. Life on the homestead became a tense performance. Clara, as Elena, worked from dawn until dusk. She baked bread, tended the vegetable patch, mended Sealers' shirts with careful, invisible stitches. She was the perfect, quiet bride, and she watched. She saw how he handled his rifle with a calm, practiced familiarity. She noted he never spoke of neighbors, never went to town unless absolutely necessary. He would sometimes stand on the porch at night, staring into the darkness, his posture rigid, as if listening for an echo of something. She began to map his routines, his moods, looking for the crack in his stone-faced exterior. The crack came 2 weeks later, during a thunderstorm. A sudden, violent downpour turned the creek into a roaring brown torrent. Sealers, who had been checking the north fence line, came back soaked and shivering. By nightfall, he was burning with fever. Clara, drawing on memories of tending to sick asylum inmates, made a poultice of mustard and whiskey. She sat by his bed, replacing cold cloths on his forehead. In his delirium, he spoke. He muttered about the cavalry, about a skirmish at Little Bighorn. He cried out a name, Ben. And then, clearer than anything, he said, "I didn't push her, I found her. God, I just found her." Clara froze, the cloth dripping in her hand. When the fever broke, a different man seemed to look out from Silas's eyes. The wall of distance had a fissure. Over a breakfast of weak broth, he spoke without prompting. "You've been digging," he said, his voice raw. He wasn't talking about the garden. Clara felt her blood go cold. She prepared to bolt, but he just sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "The box under the floor, I know you found it. Most women would have left." Clara met his gaze. "I'm not most women." A faint, grim smile touched his lips. "No," he said, "you're not." He told her the story that night. The real Elena Darrow had arrived just as planned, but she was not the woman from the letters. She was timid, terrified of the emptiness, prone to fits of weeping. She hated the isolation. After 3 days, she demanded he take her back to Seneca Springs. He refused. He had paid the fare, invested in a partner. They argued by the creek. He walked away to cool his temper. When he returned an hour later, she was gone. He found her body at the bottom of a rocky ravine, her neck broken. It could have been a slip. It could have been a jump. The sheriff, a lazy man who distrusted mail-order situations, eyed Silas with suspicion but had no proof. The inquest ruled it an accidental death. But the town of Seneca Springs had already tried and convicted Silas Gage in the court of gossip. "The payment in the ledger?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Silas looked down at his hands. "To a man I served with, he worked for the stagecoach line, to alter the passenger manifest, to make it seem she never arrived here at all. I thought if I erased her coming, the questions would stop. He had bought a lie to bury a tragedy." Clara understood that currency better than anyone. In that moment, she wasn't Elena the bride or Clara the inmate. She was another soul holding a secret too heavy to carry alone. A fragile, dangerous understanding passed between them. This understanding changed the silence in the cabin. It was no longer just empty space. It was now a shared secret, a fortified wall against the outside world. Clara stopped planning her escape. She started building a life, not as Elena, but as herself, a self she was inventing day by day. She planted a proper kitchen garden. She traded eggs with a passing homesteader's wife for seed packets. She found a talent for tanning rabbit hides. Silas, in turn, began to talk. He taught her how to track, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to fire his spare rifle. He called her Clara once when he thought she wasn't listening. It was the first time she'd heard her real name spoken in kindness in 2 years. But the outside world had not forgotten either of them. The first threat arrived on horseback in the form of U.S. Marshal John Thorne. He came asking about Silas Gage, about his time as a scout, about rumors of unsold government rifles. He was a broad, clean-shaven man with eyes that missed nothing. He took tea on the porch, his gaze sweeping over Clara, the cabin, the well-tended garden. "You keep a fine place, Mrs. Gage," he said, testing the title. Clara, her heart a drum in her chest, simply nodded. "My husband is a quiet man, he tends his land." The marshal smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Quiet men often have the loudest histories," he said before riding away. He was not there for Elena Darrow. He was there for Silas's past, and he had seen Clara. The second threat came by post. A letter from the Lyon Marriage Bureau, addressed to Elena Darrow at the Wolf Creek homestead. The agency was conducting a routine audit, it said. They requested a confirming letter from the bride to close her file permanently and release her final payment, a $5 security bond to her husband. It was a bureaucratic formality, but it was a lifeline yanking her back to Chicago. If she didn't respond, they might investigate. If she did respond, her handwriting would be compared to the original Elena's letters on file. It was a trap, no matter which way she turned. Clara showed the letter to Silas. He read it, his face hardening. "We don't answer it," he said. "They'll forget." But Clara, who had lived inside institutions, knew better. "Bureaucracies don't forget," she said. "They file, and one day someone opens the file." They argued, their first real fight. Silas wanted to burn the letter and fortify the homestead. Clara saw a narrow path through the paperwork. "I have to write back," she insisted. "But I need the original letters she sent you." To copy her hand. Silas reluctantly retrieved the packet of letters from the real Elena. Clara spent 3 nights practicing, her hand cramping, filling scraps of paper with loops and lines, until she could mimic the gentle, sloping script. She composed a short, cheerful note about the beauty of Nebraska and the kindness of her husband. She signed it Elena Gage, adopting Silas's name as her own for the first time. They mailed it from Seneca Springs, a calculated risk. For a month, they lived in a state of suspended dread, waiting for the agency's response. The response that came was not from the agency. It was a wire telegram sent to the general store in Seneca Springs. The storekeeper's boy rode out to deliver it. It was addressed to Silas. The message was only 10 words. Fugitive inmate believed heading west. Stop. Be vigilant. Stop. Father offers reward. It was from the superintendent of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Clara's father had not given up. He had used his money and influence to widen the hunt, framing her escape not as a flight, but as a danger to the public. The net was tightening, and now Silas held its edge in his hands. He read the telegram on the porch, his expression unreadable. He looked from the paper to Clara, who stood in the doorway, her face pale with terror. He didn't say a word. He simply folded the telegram, struck a match, and let it burn to ash in the tin coffee can he used for refuse. He watched the last curl of smoke rise into the Nebraska sky. Then he turned to her. "We have a bigger problem than the Marriage Bureau," he said. "They're not just looking for you anymore. They're telling people to look for you with me." The wire changed everything. It wasn't just a search, it was a beacon. And in the Nebraska territory, beacons drew more than just lawmen. 3 days after Silas burned the telegram, a man rode into the yard. He wasn't a marshal. He wore a city suit, dusty from travel, and carried a leather satchel. He introduced himself as Mr. Alastair Finch, an investigator for the Lyon Marriage Bureau's Fidelity Assurance Department. His smile was thin, professional. "A routine follow-up," he said, his eyes cataloging the cabin, Clara's garden, the well-maintained rifle leaning by the door. "For our client's peace of mind and yours." Finch asked to see Clara alone. Silas hovered nearby, a dark presence by the barn, but the investigator insisted. Inside, Finch didn't sit. He opened his satchel and produced a file. In it were the letters, the ones the real Elena Darrow had sent to the agency, and the one Clara had forged and sent just weeks before. He placed them side by side on the table. "Handwriting is a fascinating thing, Mrs. Gage," he said, his tone conversational. "It carries the weight of a person's history. Their education, their state of mind." He pointed to the earlier letters. "This woman's hand is uncertain, prone to smudges. She was anxious." He then pointed to Clara's forgery. "This is confident, steady, almost too perfect, as if someone were trying very hard to remember how to be her." Clara's mouth went dry. She kept her face still, a skill honed in the asylum. "Life out here gives a person steadiness," she said, her voice even. Finch nodded slowly, but his eyes were skeptical. "Indeed, it also changes vocabulary. The Elena Darrow who wrote to us spoke of fetching water and fancy bonnets. Your letter mentions drawing from the well and a serviceable sun hat. Different lexicons, Mrs. Gage, almost as if you learned your English in different parlors." He closed the file. "My report will note the discrepancy. The agency may choose to invalidate the contract, which would make you, legally, not a wife, but a debtor in possession of stolen travel funds." He left without another word, mounting his horse and tipping his hat. The threat was clear, bureaucratic, and chilling. Invalidating the contract wouldn't just expose her, it would criminalize her. Silas walked to her side as the dust settled. "We have to leave," he said, his voice low. "Now, before his report gets back, before your father's reward hunters connect the dots here." But leaving meant abandoning the only safety they had, the isolation, the stocked root cellar, the defensible position of the homestead. It meant becoming fugitives in the open. They spent a feverish day preparing. Silas buried his army service papers and a small cache of silver coins near the creek. Clara packed 2 saddlebags with food, ammunition, and her few precious things, the stolen spoon from the asylum, the wildflower tin. They decided to head north toward the Dakota border, where land was even emptier and questions were fewer. They would leave at first light. That night they didn't sleep. They sat by the cold stove, listening to the wind. Silas finally spoke the fear they both held. Finch wasn't just here for the agency, he was looking for something, or someone. He had the eyes of a bounty hunter. Dawn was a gray smear on the horizon when the dogs started barking. Not the usual yap at a coyote, but a deep, urgent alarm. Silas was at the window in an instant, rifle in hand. "Riders," he hissed, 3 of them, not Finch. Clara peered out. The men were rough-looking, dressed in a mixture of trail gear and worn-out army surplus. They fanned out as they approached the cabin, hands resting near their gun belts. The leader, a man with a patchy beard and a mismatched pair of pistols, called out. "Sealers Gage, we are here on behalf of a concerned citizen looking for a lost daughter we understand you might have taken in a stray." These were the reward hunters, drawn by the telegram like vultures to a scent. They had bypassed the law entirely. Sealers shoved Clara toward the back window. "The root cellar, go now," she froze. "I won't leave you to them." "You have to," he snapped, his face fierce. "If they take you, you go back to the asylum. If they find you with me, they'll hang me for kidnapping and God knows what else. Go." He pushed her toward the hall just as the leader outside lost patience. "We ain't asking twice, Gabe." A shot rang out, shattering the window pane above Sealers' head. He returned fire not to hit, but to drive them back. The roar of the rifle in the confined space was deafening. Clara scrambled through the back window, dropping into the vegetable garden. She could hear shouting, more shots, the thunder of hooves as the men took cover. She crawled, her dress snagging on squash vines, toward the root cellar door hidden by a pile of lumber. Just as her hand touched the rusty handle, a shadow fell over her. One of the riders had circled the cabin. He was young, with hungry eyes and bad teeth. He grinned, leveling a pistol at her. "Well, look what the cat didn't drag in." He grabbed her arm, yanking her to her feet. "The old man in Virginia is paying $500 for you alive. Reckon we can manage that." From the front of the house, the gunfire intensified. Sealers was fighting, but he was 1 against 3. The young man began to drag her toward the horses. In that moment, Clara stopped being a fugitive or a bride. She became the girl who had survived the asylum. Her free hand, scrabbling at her side, closed around the only weapon she had, the heavy iron spoon tucked in her sash. As he turned to shout to his companions, she swung it with all her strength, not at his head, but at the side of his knee. There was a sickening crack and a howl of pain. He dropped, clutching his leg. Clara didn't hesitate. She snatched his fallen pistol, a heavy Colt, and ran, not toward the woods but toward the barn. She heard Sealers shout her name, a raw sound of fear and fury. She burst into the barn, scattering chickens. Sealers' big draft horse, Jasper, stamped in his stall. She didn't have time to saddle him. She threw a bridle over his head, led him to a mounting block, and hauled herself onto his broad back. Kicking his sides, she urged the horse out of the barn and straight toward the front of the cabin. The scene was chaos. 1 rider was down, clutching his shoulder. The leader was trading shots with Sealers from behind the water trough. The 3rd man, seeing Clara on the horse, turned his weapon on her. "The girl," he yelled. Clara did the only thing she could think of. She pointed the Colt, a gun she'd never fired, pulled the trigger, and screamed. The shot went wide, but the explosion and the sudden charge of the massive horse broke the gunman's concentration. Sealers used the distraction. He rose from his cover and fired twice. The leader stumbled back, hit. The remaining mounted man, seeing 2 of his companions down, wheeled his horse and fled, kicking up a cloud of dust. Sudden silence was louder than the gunfight. Smoke drifted in the yard. The wounded men groaned. Sealers stood by the trough, breathing heavily, his rifle smoking. Clara slid from Jasper's back, her legs trembling. Sealers crossed the yard in quick strides, his eyes scanning her for injuries. He saw the pistol in her hand, the wild look in her eyes. He didn't embrace her. He simply took the gun from her shaking hand, checked the cylinder, and nodded. "You're a hell of a shot," he said, his voice rough. "For missing completely." A laugh, born of sheer, screaming adrenaline, bubbled out of Clara. It turned into a sob halfway through. They had won the skirmish, but they had lost the war. The homestead was now a battlefield. The wounded men were evidence. The one who fled would tell others. They had minutes, maybe an hour. They dragged the 2 injured reward hunters into the barn, bound them with rope, and left them with a canteen of water. It was more mercy than they would have received. They saddled 2 horses properly now, loaded the saddlebags, and within 20 minutes they were riding north, leaving Wolf Creek behind. They rode hard for 2 days, avoiding trails, sticking to dry washes and ridges. The shared violence had forged a new, harder bond between them. They spoke little, conserving energy, their senses tuned to every distant sound. On the 3rd day, they reached the Niobrara River, a silver ribbon cutting through the hills. It was there, watering the horses, that Sealers finally broke the silence. "We can't run forever," he said, his face etched with exhaustion. "Finch's report, those bounty hunters. They're 2 strands of the same rope, and it's tightening." He looked at her, really looked at her. "Clara, I need to know, do you want to keep running, or do you want to fight? Clara sat on a river stone, her feet in the cool water. She thought of the asylum, of the cage of her father's expectations, of pretending to be a dead woman. She thought of the garden she'd left behind, of the first time Sealers called her by her name. "I'm tired of things being taken from me," she said quietly. "My choices, my name, my home, I want to fight, but I don't know how." Sealers crouched beside her. "Then we stop reacting, we find out who's pulling the strings. Your father started this with the telegram, but Finch, he was different. That was a corporate hunter. Somebody paid for that specific attention." A terrible, clear thought formed in Clara's mind. What if they're not separate? She asked. What if my father didn't just send a telegram to lawmen? What if he also wrote a check to the Lion Marriage Bureau to send their best investigator to find his unwell daughter and nullify her fraudulent marriage? The idea was monstrous, and it made perfect, brutal sense. It was the kind of tidy, legal destruction her father, a wealthy industrialist, would engineer. To fight, they needed information. They needed to turn the hunt around, and that meant they couldn't go to Dakota. They had to go back toward the source of the poison. They needed to get to a telegraph office, to find a newspaper, to understand the full shape of the hunt. It was a desperate, dangerous plan. They would have to move east, toward the railroads and the towns, the very places crawling with people who might recognize them. They would have to become shadows in the light. As they mounted up, turning their horses not north, but southeast, Clara felt a strange calm settle over her. The running was over. Now they were going hunting. And their first target was the truth about the man who had started it all, her father, and the expensive, invisible net he had cast across the west to drag his daughter back to her cage. They rode into the town of Grand Island not as fugitives, but as ghosts. It was the nearest place with a telegraph office connected to the eastern wires, a place where they could listen to the whispers of the hunt. Sealers stayed with the horses in a copse of trees outside town while Clara, her hair tucked under a wide bonnet and wearing a dress traded from a passing homesteader, walked into the telegraph office alone. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She approached the counter, her voice low. "I'm here to inquire about placing a notice. A family matter. I need to see recent bulletins from back east, specifically concerning missing persons or asylum alerts." The clerk, a bored young man, shrugged. "Bulletin boards over there, public notices, help yourself." The board was a chaotic collage of wanted posters, livestock sales, and railway timetables. And there, pinned near the bottom, was a fresh, crisply printed notice. "Missing and considered dangerous." It featured a shockingly accurate sketch of Clara's face, taken from a society portrait her father must have provided. The description listed her as Clara Finley, a delicate woman suffering from nervous hysteria, escaped from compassionate care. It promised a $600 reward for information leading to her safe recovery, contacted via Finley Consolidated Ironworks, care of Mr. Alastair Finch. The final line turned her blood cold, maybe accompanied by a male accomplice, possibly using the alias Sealers Gage, wanted for questioning in an unrelated matter. Her father hadn't just hired the Lion investigator, he had made him the public face of the hunt. Finch wasn't just a bureaucrat, he was a hired gun in a suit, and he had connected Sealers to her. Clara memorized the details and left, her steps measured until she was out of sight. Then she ran back to the trees. She told Sealers everything. His face darkened at the mention of Finch's name on the poster. "He's consolidating the hunt," Sealers muttered, "making it one clean package. Your father doesn't want scandal, he wants you erased and forgotten. Finch is the eraser." They needed to disrupt that consolidation. They needed to introduce a new, messy truth. Their plan was audacious. They would use the very tool her father wielded, the telegraph, but they would send a story, not a query. Sealers knew a man, an old cavalry telegraph operator turned newspaperman in Omaha named Horace Wheeler, who hated injustice and loved a good story. That night, from a different, smaller station, Sealers sent a paid wire to Wheeler. It was a simple, dramatic narrative. "Stop printing Finley Ironworks lies." "Stop Elena Darrow died accidental Wolf Creek 1882. Stop her imposter is Clara Finley committed asylum for refusing forced marriage. Stop now hunted by father's hired gun Finch. Stop seeking justice, not reward. Stop Gage." It was a grenade tossed into the middle of her father's tidy narrative. If Wheeler bit, the story could spread faster than the reward notice. They waited for 3 tense days in an abandoned line shack, jumping at every sound. On the fourth day, Sealers rode to a different town and returned with a folded copy of the Omaha Herald. On the second page was the headline, Iron Tycoon's Daughter or Asylum Inmate, the Double Mystery of the Nebraska Bride. Wheeler had done more than bite, he had feasted. The article presented both sides, the father's claim of a fragile daughter and the shocking counterclaim of a sane woman imprisoned for disobedience, now fleeing a bounty placed by the very man who committed her. It mentioned the late Elena Darrow and the mysterious Sealers Gage, framing him not as an accomplice, but as a potential protector. The public narrative was now cracked wide open. The crack created unexpected leverage. 2 days later, U.S. Marshal John Thorne found them. He didn't come with a posse, he came alone, his expression unreadable. He sat on a stump outside the line shack, accepting a cup of coffee. I read the newspaper, he said bluntly, and I made some wires of my own, to Trans-Allegheny, to the Philadelphia police about one Elena Darrow, to the Army about one Sealers Gage. He looked at Clara. The asylum superintendent confirmed your commitment was arranged by your father with a generous donation. No medical board ever reviewed it. He then turned to Sealers. The Philadelphia police have no missing person report for Elena Darrow matching your timeline, but the Army has a record. Sergeant Sealers Gage, honorable discharge, commendations for bravery at Little Bighorn. And a witness statement from a fellow scout about a man named Ben Harper who sold condemned Army rifles to whiskey traders. You testified against him. He was discharged in disgrace. He vowed revenge. Thorne took a sip of coffee. Ben Harper is now a county sheriff in Kansas. He also happens to be the brother-in-law of one Alastair Finch. This isn't just about a runaway daughter anymore. This is a man using a private hunt to settle an old grudge. Finch isn't just collecting your father's money, he's doing a favor for family. He wants Gage, and you, Miss Finley, are the perfect bait to draw him out. The revelation landed like a physical blow. The conspiracy was deeper and more personal than they had imagined. Clara's father was a willing patron, but the true hunter was motivated by a blood feud. Marshal Thorne laid out a choice. They could keep running forever, or they could let him use their situation to draw Finch into the open. Thorne wanted Harper for the illegal arms dealing and Finch for obstruction and likely conspiracy to kidnap, but he needed them as willing witnesses, not fleeing suspects. It meant turning themselves in, legally, to Thorne's custody. It meant trusting the system that had failed them both so catastrophically. Clara and Sealers looked at each other across the fire. The fear was there, but beneath it was a deeper exhaustion with the running. "What's the play?" Sealers asked, his voice gravelly. The play was a trap. With Thorne's guidance, they sent another wire, this one to Finch's known office in Chicago, care of the Lion Bureau. It was from a concerned citizen near Grand Island, claiming to have seen the woman from the poster and the man Gage, holed up and sick in a specific canyon in the Sandhills. It was bait. Thorne would be waiting there with 2 deputized marshals. Clara and Sealers would be there too, visible as the lure. The canyon was a stark, beautiful place of wind-sculpted sandstone. They felt exposed, sitting by a small, smokeless fire. The hours ticked by. Just as doubt began to creep in, they came. Not just Finch, but 4 men. Finch on a fine bay horse and 3 rough-looking riders, Harper's men, not bounty hunters. They fanned out at the canyon's mouth. Finch rode forward slowly, a smile on his face. "Mrs. Gage, or should I say Miss Finley, your father will be so relieved." Then he looked at Sealers. "And Sergeant Gage, Ben sends his regards. He's looking forward to your reunion." That was the signal. Thorne and his men rose from behind the rocks, rifles leveled. "U.S. Marshal, throw down your weapons. Alastair Finch, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit kidnapping and obstruction of justice." For a second, Finch looked stunned. Then his face twisted in fury. He went for the pistol at his hip. One of Harper's men shot first, the bullet kicking up dirt at Thorne's feet. The canyon exploded with gunfire. It was a short, brutal fight. Finch was shot from his horse, wounded in the leg. 2 of Harper's men were subdued. The 3rd fled and was later captured. Sealers, during the chaos, had placed himself squarely between Clara and the line of fire, not firing a shot, just being a shield. When the smoke cleared, Thorne had his prisoners. He looked at Sealers and Clara. "You kept your word, you're free to go. The material witness warrants are void. I have what I need from them." He nodded toward the cursing Finch. "This one will sing to save his skin. He'll implicate Harper and likely your father's financial arrangements. The newspaper story did its work. No judge will dismiss this now." They were free, truly, legally free. The combined weight of the asylum, the bounty, the fraudulent marriage contract, and the personal feud, all of it lifted. They rode away from the canyon in a daze, the silence now a peaceful thing, not a fearful one. They returned to Wolf Creek. The homestead was weathered but standing. Clara's garden had wilted, but the roots were alive. They began again, this time in the open light. Clara Finley never resumed that name. She petitioned the territorial court under the name Clara Gage, citing her long-standing use of the name and her marriage in fact, if not in initial paperwork. With Thorne's testimony about the Lion Bureau's corrupt involvement, the judge granted it. She was, legally and finally, herself, a woman of her own making. Sealers sold a portion of his land to the railroad that came through a year later, not the piece with the house or the creek, but a barren eastern section. The money was enough. They used it to build a proper room onto the cabin and to order books from a catalog. Clara started a small school for the children of scattered homesteaders, teaching them letters and numbers. She never spoke of the asylum. She spoke of resilience. The final surprise came 5 years after the canyon, in a letter from Marshall Thorne. He wrote that her father, facing public scandal and potential charges of false imprisonment after Finch's testimony, had suffered a stroke. His business empire was faltering. The letter contained no gloating, just a simple statement of fact. Enclosed was a clipped obituary from a Philadelphia paper for Alastair Finch, who had died in prison of an infection. And one last line, Ben Harper is serving 10 years at Fort Leavenworth. The world is slightly more square. Be well. Clara read the letter on the porch, then threw it into the cookfire. She watched the words turn to ash and float away on the same wind that rustled through her thriving garden. That garden became her testament. She cultivated plants that had no business surviving in the Nebraska sand, roses from cuttings sent by a former student, an apple tree she nursed from a withered sapling, mint that spread like a green rumor. Sealers built an arch over the gate, and on it he carved a simple phrase, "What was planted in darkness." He never finished the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone who saw it understood. They lived out their days in the house he built with timber hauled 40 miles. The silence between them was no longer a wall or a secret, but a comfortable, well-worn path. They had chosen each other not in a moment of desperation, but again and again, every day after, in the full knowledge of who they both were, flawed, scarred, and fiercely loyal. The past stayed behind them, not as a buried threat, but as a closed book. They had written a new one together in the stubborn soil of Wolf Creek. And as the years turned, the story of the mail-order bride who wasn't and the soldier with a secret faded from gossip into something closer to legend. A whisper on the prairie wind about love that wasn't found, but forged in the hardest of fires. The story of Clara and Sealers Gage is more than a tale of escape. It is a map of a hidden world within the American West, drawn by those the official histories forgot. It reveals the desperate geography of the late 19th century, a landscape where a woman's body and mind could be legally owned by her father, her husband, or the state, and where the only paths to freedom were often terrifying gambles through uncharted social territory. The mail-order bride system, for all its risks and romantic illusions, functioned for some as a legitimate escape, hatched from poverty, abuse, or confinement. It was a rare transaction where a woman, however perilously, could negotiate her own fate. Clara's journey from inmate to imposter to a woman who carved her own name into the law speaks to a profound, quiet rebellion. She did not storm the asylum gates with a gun. She slipped out through a drain. She did not defeat the patriarchy in a courtroom. She outlasted it in a remote canyon with the help of a flawed man who chose to be her ally. Her victory was not in grand liberation, but in the hard-won right to simply be left alone, to tend a garden, teach children, and share a life with someone who saw her not as a commodity or a diagnosis, but as a person. The asylum telegraph, the bounty notice, the investigator's file, these were the tools of a new kind of control, one administered through paperwork and private contracts. Clara and Sealers' story shows us the moment when the old frontier of brute force began to merge with the modern frontier of bureaucratic power. Their triumph was in turning those very tools, the newspaper, the legal witness statement, the truth, against the system that sought to crush them. Today, the Wolf Creek homestead is gone. The sandhills reclaimed the cabin's logs and the garden's fence posts. But if you know where to look, you can still find the foundation stones, and near them, a single, stubborn apple tree that blooms white every spring. It is a living relic of what can grow when someone refuses to accept the life they were assigned. The legacy of Clara Finley Gage is not in monuments, but in the quiet understanding that sometimes the most radical act is not a dramatic escape, but the daily, deliberate work of building a home where you are truly free. Their story asks us a final, lingering question: how many other lives, equally desperate and brave, were lost to the silence of the prairie or the cold records of an asylum? How many Alinas vanished without a trace, and how many Claras never made it out of the culvert? History is written by the survivors. This is the story of two of them. If you found this journey through the shadows of history compelling, there are countless other untold stories waiting to be discovered. Subscribe and join us next time as we continue to unearth the hidden lives that shaped our world. Thank you for listening.